Right. Welcome, everyone. Hi, my name is Anwar Hijaz, and today we are going to be having an amazing webinar with the one and only Anna Mills. The title of the webinar is Building Your Own Multi-Pronged Approach to Reducing AI Misuse in Writing and Assignments. So I want to start off by introducing Anna. Anna Mills has taught writing in California community colleges for over 20 years and is an author of an open educational resource textbook, How Arguments Work, a guide to writing and analyzing texts in California. Before the release of ChatGPT, she started a very popular resource list on AI in higher education, hosted by the Writing Across the Curriculum Clearinghouse. Her essays on AI appear in the Chronicles of Higher Education and Inside Higher Ed, and she serves on the Modern Language Association and Conference on College Composition and Communication Task Force on writing and AI, and as a faculty for the American Association of Colleges and Universities, and lots more. We're really looking forward to the webinar today, but before we get started, I also wanted to give a little bit of information. So during the webinar, we will be sharing a link to a feedback survey. The link will be posted in the chat at the 40-minute mark, and then after that, every 10 minutes. This is a 60-minute webinar. Your input really helps the CBC to improve in designing programming that better supports the needs of the system. So we really appreciate your time, and it is a short survey. Lastly, while @ONE provides badges for course completion, we do not offer a badge for attending this webinar. However, if your institution requires proof of attendance for flex credit or professional advancement, please stay until the end, complete the survey and request a copy of your responses via the Google form. And hopefully you can use that as confirmation for your attendance. And of course, if you have any questions, you can reach out to the CBC team. So with that being said, I will go ahead and pass it to Anna.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here with you. I love the energy in the chat. Keep that up. I think there's a warm community feel and excitement in there. So I'm pretty much going to dive in. I'm going to give kind of a survey of approaches to addressing AI misuse from my perspective as a writing teacher. I'm teaching online asynchronous composition right now. And so I'm going to survey different practices and tell you what I do. And the core of it is sort of framing the value of writing, making assignments motivating, but also setting up some guardrails to discourage misuse that could interfere with learning, and inviting students to kind of tutoring style AI assistance if they're going to use AI. So that's the TLDR. And the slides, the link should be in the chat. They're open for comments, and feel free to share resources and comments in the chat. If you want to ask a question, I'll pause at the end of each section, and at that point I'll look in the Q&A probably. So if you want to make sure I see it, maybe the Q&A is a good bet. Yes to writing. I feel like the first and foremost, most effective and most powerful thing we can do now, if we want to teach with writing in whatever discipline, is to help people understand how it can be valuable. So this is a core tenet of the Writing Across the Curriculum movement, and it's featured in a statement on AI from the Association for Writing Across the Curriculum. They say that writing is a mode of learning. Students develop understanding and insights through the act of writing. So really emphasizing that it's about what the process can give us, not about the product of text. So kind of to do that, I start out my composition course framing that idea, inviting students to comment on a reading about it from my textbook, and really making the case that this is a core offering of academia, that we know how to teach sharper thinking through writing. and that writing can help us slow down and clarify our ideas, and that can be useful in so many domains of life. And I also frame the idea that writing has meaning as collaborative human communication, that by writing in college, they're joining this conversation of voices across time and place, and we're giving each other help and input. So I try to return to this idea throughout each time I assign writing. I'm trying to have a purpose section inspired by my training from this organization. So letting them know how this writing practice will help them clarify an idea or develop a skill that will have meaning for them. And finally, I think, sometimes you hear the idea that we won't need to learn how to write because AI can produce text that's ever more sophisticated. And I just really push back on that, arguing that it's kind of the opposite, that these are systems we interact with using words. We describe what we want to them. And then we read what they give us. And we have to write and we have to read critically. And that practice of doing that is more important than ever, even if we believe we're going to have a future of working with AI. So, that all sounds nice, but how do we design assignments that feel meaningful, that feel like students are getting something out of it, that is what they're looking for? So here is where we can really look to best practices in writing instruction to design around intrinsic motivation and supporting writing practices. There's a lot we can draw on, and I just put a link in here to the National Council of Teachers of English sort of, set of core ideas for the teaching of writing. And these will probably be familiar to you and no big surprises, but these are things that I ever have to return to and renew and think, how can I do this more or differently? So assignments that have some intrinsic meaning or purpose, that are likely to be motivating, that have some room for creativity, original thinking, and choice on the student's part. And the other part would be to invite writing in the context of relationships, human audiences, community. So, if they know that their peers are going to read what they wrote and might find something interesting in it, that's very different from writing for a bot. So ways we can do this, traditionally, we might be through conferences, it might be through video or audio feedback from us or from classmates. It might be asking student writers to share audio or video notes about their writing with classmates. So, bringing that sense of writing as a conversation to life in the classroom. Now, if you're teaching a writing class, you're probably building in writing processes like pre-writing, brainstorming, outlining, peer review, maybe even starting with annotation of readings, reflections on the thinking and writing process, sort of the metacognitive piece, maybe requiring tutor visits, revision, right? So this is harder in a class where you're not focusing on writing, but it's still possible. And it's possible to do bits and pieces, if not everything, so that the writer is supported throughout this process where they're clarifying their ideas. It's less about get those exact right words submitted to Canvas, and it's more about how can this evolve? How can I clarify my understanding through this process? I mentioned annotation because that's one of my favorite ways to encourage students to begin writing more naturally. I think that annotation platforms where they can see each other's comments really encourage kind of a social media-like feel where it's more informal and there's that curiosity about what did my peers say about this? What was their question? Can I answer it? Did they have a similar experience? So that begins the process of writing as speaking back to other texts. So some of these practices involve a lot of labor and time on the teacher's part, but there are a few ways to try to minimize that. Um, I'm able to assign students to visit tutors. So, that's not necessarily me conferencing with every student for every paper, but they are conferencing. Um, if you're assigning social annotation, you may be able to give automatic credit for that. In Perusal, there is a free option for using Perusal, and there is a way to get it to give credit for participation and writing comments, and that's less teacher labor. Um, and similarly with process assignments, we may not be giving feedback on every brainstorm outline draft, right? But I still put in a warm invitation to ask for feedback at any point. Um, and but I can then assign more process steps without, endless grading. So now a moment for you to sort of share. I'm sure much of this is very familiar to you, um, but I would love to know in this Mentimeter poll that I'm just putting in the chat, what practices you already use that I described and what practices you would want to use more. Um, and I guess I would just say that, these practices don't directly address AI, but the idea is that um, by clarifying the purpose and making the work more appealing and more possible for students, that's a first step, maybe the most powerful one toward reducing the tendency to try to offload that work and miss out on that teaching experience, on that learning experience. And yes, to the question in the chat, Perusal does sync with Canvas. It's a separate app, but you can link up the gradebook. Yeah, so please do respond on that Mentimeter, and I
And
will switch to show that. Yeah,
And
yes,
while people are responding, there are a few questions that came in. If
yeah.
you, I can read them, or if you want to pull them up. One of them was, can you give examples of the kinds of writing projects you assign to promote intrinsic motivation? And then another one was, how do you ensure voice notes are accessible for deaf students? We now have Pronto, which offers voice but does not auto caption.
Ah,
There's a third question.
great. Thank you for those questions. Um, I offer a research paper that's very open-ended, and I help students develop a topic of their choice, which might have to do with video games or sports or their career or really anything that they're curious about, e-bikes. Um, so I also offer the option if I've, assigned a response paper. So I do assign, response papers where they're summarizing and responding to another reading. But I will say I give them options for which article to respond to. And I say, if you don't like any of these articles, just propose another one. So trying to always say, the most important thing is that they are finding meaning in the assignment. And if they're not, I'll work with them to adapt it. Um, and then as far as the voice notes, I'm not an expert. I'm glad to know there's some move toward it in Pronto. Um, I do know that when I have students use Canvas Studio to create videos that they then share with classmates, and those are automatically captioned, I believe. But someone can jump in maybe and help me who has a better answer on that. Um, and then I think there was a middle question that I may have missed. Um,
The next question was, are you allowed to require tutor visits in an asynchronous course?
Um, where I teach at College of Marin, I am allowed to do that. in part because we offer such flexible options for tutoring, including Zoom and an option that's essentially an email exchange with a tutor, so it can be done asynchronously through our online writing center. But I recognize that's a tricky question and may not be possible everywhere. One thing I'll do is to, assign tutoring, but say you could do an alternative of meeting with a friend or family member and just talking to them about your piece. Maybe doing my best to encourage the tutoring, but providing alternatives might be one option. So yeah, this is really interesting. So what people are already doing, making assignments motivating is at the top, assigning steps in the writing process next, making learning social, um, not quite as much, but still quite a few for oral assignments. Um, and that's interesting, not as much on framing the value of writing. Sometimes I wonder, is that talking at students when we say writing is useful in these ways? We really have to make it come to life. So I see that people are gravitating toward that. Um, so you can use your arrow key to move on if you haven't already to the next slide, which asks what you want to do more of, where you feel like you can grow in terms of these strategies. Um, so interesting that the top response so far is making writing more social. Um, and um, And then the next slide is a chance to sort of comment in an open-ended way about those responses. Um, and these are great. I hope I'd like to share the Mentimeter responses on the slides later as a resource for other teachers. So you can see what everyone else has said. Um, Yeah, and I think this one speaks to where I'm going to go next, which is someone saying it seems that no amount of intrinsic or social motivation overcomes the fact that my students are telling me they don't have time to do the work themselves. Um, and I've, certainly come up against moments like that in my own life where it's like, I have the best will in the world and I can't do all the things I'm supposed to do. So I think the empathy for that experience of the student is important. And then we also have to figure out what else can we do in the course besides motivation, if that's not always going to work. Um, um, and one person is saying using AI to promote collaborative learning. Um, that's interesting. So yeah, AI might figure into one of these approaches. Um, and there's so many great points here. I think I am gonna, if that's okay, sort of move on. And but keep putting things in there, and I do want to share it and really review it and reflect on it at the end. But I think where I've arrived at, I do all those things and I try to do them better each semester. I recognize it'll never be perfect, but I also find that we need guardrails. We need something else to discourage outsourcing of the work because there will be so many temptations and pressures on students. Um, and if they think their classmates are outsourcing it, that's another pressure. And I like this quote from Trisha Bertram Gallant, who's an academic integrity program director at UC San Diego. I'm going to cite her a lot in this presentation. She's a big influence on me and is an author of the book, The Opposite of Cheating, Teaching for Integrity in the Age of AI. So she's just saying trusting students not to cheat isn't fair to the students who don't cheat, no matter what. And that for all other human behaviors, we kind of understand that people need some help sticking to their goals or keeping their promises. Um, I certainly find that in parenting, right? I want to structure things so that my kids do the right thing for the right reasons, but sometimes they need a little accountability as well. That said, this brings up a lot of concerns, deeply felt concerns that I hear from teachers, that, we're not here to police students, that we want to build trust, that we don't want an adversarial relationship. And yeah, I think I used the term offloading. I just meant students skipping the work, and making AI do the work for them. That's all I meant. Thanks for asking about that in the chat. So, the question of how common is it to outsource your work to AI, to use AI in non-transparent ways that are not what the teacher is recommending. There have been various exposés suggesting that it's really widespread. I don't know if those are exaggerated. I don't think they're based on large-scale studies. There was this one in New York Magazine a few months back. But even if they're a bit exaggerated, there is clearly some increased level of outsourcing things to AI. And even if there's just a perception of that, that's going to affect the value of the course credits and the grades, students' own perception of the value of what they're doing and whether it's worthwhile. And so, even the most motivating pedagogy will come up against cases where students are tempted and pressured to take shortcuts. And fundamentally, if we don't know what is AI and what is the students, we don't know if they're learning, right? So we can't assess. We've got to find ways to reduce possible learning loss and make it possible to assess. You're probably aware that there's no perfect way to do this. But I would just say that doesn't mean there's nothing meaningful we can do. I really like the approach of Philip Dawson coming out of Australia. There's a lot of great academic integrity work coming from there, and he talks about a Swiss cheese approach, which is a little bit of a silly metaphor, but the idea that, each layer of cheese has some holes in it, but they're in different places. So if you stack up lots of layers of sliced cheese and they all have different holes, maybe you do get something that prevents anything from getting through. Maybe you do significantly reduce misuse of AI if you use a lot of different approaches. I also like the metaphor of guardrails because it kind of reminds us of the idea of guidance and of danger, of risk to the students, and it's the risk that they will miss learning. So what does that look like? The not so controversial one is just having an AI policy. So I'll talk about that. The more controversial ones include observing students' process, whether that's in class or somehow proctored, or through video or audio, or through process tracking of the history of a document. So I'm going to look at those and tell you how I do those things and discuss the concerns with them. And then finally, AI detection software, which is very controversial, and also imperfect. So let's actually look at those. The idea of policy is really, it's a right that the student has. And I think Katie Conrad articulates this in her blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights for education, that students should be able to expect clear guidance. Which systems are appropriate for any assignment and how should they be used and how not? And we can think of this in terms of guidance, support, helping relieve students' anxiety about what's okay and what's not, empathy for the dilemmas that they might face. Policy can come from those places. It doesn't have to be a punitive policy or a finger-wagging policy. But AI is a lot to process, and they need our help and our guidance. So I have some resources here for coming up with policies. It can be a lot to craft exactly the right policy, so it definitely helps to look at examples. And these are from a guide by Tricia Bertram-Gallant. Many of the policy guides will have 3 tiers, one where you're banning AI, one where you're allowing some use, and one where you're allowing broad use. But there's a huge collection that Lance Eaton has put together of classroom policies across multiple disciplines. Now, I find it helpful to have somebody ask me questions to help me come up with a policy. So these are more sort of templates or worksheets. Some of them interactive. This first one asks you questions about what's okay and what's not for you, and then gives you language that you can edit. Some of these worksheets, the one from Stanford Center for Teaching and Learning is really involved with many different options, makes you think about things you maybe wouldn't have thought about yet. Certainly did for me. And then there are these templates that you can just copy and edit. Another thing that I learned, though, is, those are really for syllabus policies that go in the syllabus at the beginning of the course. But, this is really something we have to return to for each assignment because it may be different for each assignment and because students will need the reminder and the tie-in to the specific ask. So I got this idea from an ESL instructor, Julie Carey at Kenyatta College. She said she has a tools and rules section for each assignment. So I really just adopted that. And here's some sample language that I use for a writing assignment where I say they're welcome to use grammar checking software, but be skeptical of the suggestions. No AI for coming up with ideas or text. And I say why. And then it gets into a little gray area, but I say you can use AI to help with research or reading comprehension as long as you do the reading yourself and don't fully trust the AI summary. So obviously I'll have to do some education in the class about what that looks like as well. And then at the end, I say, did you think of another way AI could be useful? Please run it by me. I'm open to ideas as long as it doesn't get in the way of learning. And I think one of the tricky things is that it can be hard to know when it's getting in the way of learning and when it's not, because sometimes it's helping in some ways, but maybe taking over too much in other ways. And even for people with a lot of experience, it can be hard to navigate that gray area. So one thing I'm trying is to use sort of a rule of thumb that if an ethical tutor would help you in this way, it's probably okay to ask AI for that. But if the tutor would say, no, that's crossing a line, then probably you don't want to have AI do that either. That's likely to interfere with learning. So I've kind of made that case in these 2 pages in my new OER textbook, AI in College Writing and Orientation. And you can look at those if that seems like a useful rule of thumb. I have some more guidance in there. But I do want to get into these more controversial forms of guardrails because I know there's a lot of questions about these. So was there anything pressing in terms of Q&A that I missed on these topics? Great. So for process observation, I first just want to note that observing students to know that they're doing the work can take a lot of different forms. Um, so in-class writing, right? In-class speaking, group work, anything where we're actually there watching them is a form of observation. So with online asynchronous classes, the question becomes, how can we observe them if we're not there with them? So then we look at options like video and audio assignments, online meetings, or process tracking. So, one option that I am doing with my classes is occasional video and audio recording assignments. I always offer Zoom meetings, but I haven't required them. I've thought about it, having a conference for each writing assignment. But with the video and audio, I just ask students to record a 1 to 3 minute video in Canvas Studio, talking about their ideas for an essay or their writing process, and then they share that video in a Canvas discussion, and they're responding to each other's videos. So that's a way. However, as we probably have heard, you can deep fake audio and video, and it's actually pretty easy and it's free, unfortunately. So with some platforms like HeyGen, they could, they could create a fake video of them saying AI text, right? If they really wanted to do that. So it's not foolproof. So process tracking, though, means actually asking students to share their document history. So version history in Word and Google Docs is so clunky, but there are much more user-friendly ways to engage with that data. And I'll look at those in a minute, but I think just have to acknowledge up front that even this is also not foolproof, because there are apps that are free that will type into Google Docs, right? Simulate typing over time and, even create errors and correct them automatically without the student even being involved. So definitely a cat and mouse game and not going to be perfect, but neither is cybersecurity. So some of these apps that you can use include processfeedback.org, which is free and nonprofit. Grammarly Authorship is free. And then there are other apps that are usually paid and may integrate with the Canvas or a learning management system. Some of them have the teacher pay a certain amount. Some of them are at the institutional level of subscription. And some of them include writing into a different app or not into Word or Google Docs. So I am using this, even though it's not perfect. I'm using it as a deterrent and kind of another layer of accountability. And I am using a couple different apps. I give students different options, but one is processfeedback.org. Because I met Dr. Badri Adhikari at a conference, and he's a computer science professor who has started this app and is really committed to, having it be on the student's terms. So the student sees the report on their process, and then they can choose to share it with the instructor. And there's some value in seeing some data on how they were writing for their own self-reflection. So if the student shares edit access to their Google Doc, then processfeedback.org gives me this ribbon across the top. So as I'm reading the essay, I'll see this list of how many edits and how much time was spent in the document. And I can click Explore Process to see a much more detailed report, including what was copied and pasted. And you can look at a sample of that from the link in the slides if you want. And I think it does send a message to students that some of the value of the assignment is in the process of doing it, that an app, something is taking the time and the effort to look at what they put into this. It's not perfect, but it does send a message. Grammarly authorship is sort of similar to process feedback in that the student sees the report first, and then they can share it with the instructor. So I will ask them to share either a Grammarly report or a process feedback report, or share the edit access with me so I can generate the report, or do an alternate assignment, which I'll get to in a moment. So Grammarly authorship does work with the free version of Grammarly in Google Docs or Word. And one nice thing is that if they are using Grammarly, then this report will say what text was edited with Grammarly, what text was generated by Grammarly, since Grammarly does include generative AI now. It does include text generation, even in the free version. So it does provide some transparency about that. And we have conversations about how to use Grammarly, but be skeptical of its suggestions in class. So you get a report like this that is supposed to tell you how much was typed by a human. Now, that probably can be bypassed by some kind of auto typer. And how much was copied from a source. If it was copied directly from an AI system, that would show up as AI, but that's pretty easy to bypass. But at least it shows what was copied and pasted. You can set it so that they don't have to share the history of every word they typed. And so that's one thing I really love, because I know some people would feel really self-conscious with the idea that, like, oh, I'm told to write, a really rough first draft, but the teacher's going to see every single thing I wrote. So if that makes you self-conscious, then you can not include the writing replay. And that means the teacher won't be able to see like the little movie of everything you typed and erased. But they will still see time spent and what was copied and pasted. So it will label text according to these labels that I mentioned: AI generated, copied from an unknown source, etc. And the student could see that and explain it or reflect on it to the teacher when they turn in the process report. So there are a number of steps to using Grammarly authorship. And I go through those in a sample assignment that I'll share with you that's on Canvas Commons that you can copy if you want to give your students instructions on it. They have to enable tracking. It doesn't track automatically. They have to say, start tracking this document. Yeah, I think the question about time in the chat is really important. So the thing I would say is that I don't always review all the reports, but with some of these options, I'm seeing that ribbon across the top and I'm just seeing, oh, it says they spent 5 hours. Okay. If the essay seems like they're writing, I probably am not going to look into the process report further than that. But if something is making me think, this doesn't seem quite right, then I might look further into the process report. So that's how I try to save time. So I'm not doing that much more than I would otherwise with this process tracking, but I am including a layer so I can look into it if it feels like it's needed. And that's also a layer that's a deterrent for the student.
Yeah, there's a few questions that came in on this
Yeah,
discussion.
please.
Is how do students respond to process tracking from your experience?
I have surveyed my students anonymously, and it's interesting. Most of them say they think it's necessary. And a very few of them will choose the alternate assignment, which is to share something about their process with me in another way, usually through a Zoom, but also I might offer an asynchronous option like sharing a video with me or an audio of talking about it or even answering some questions about it. But it's pretty rare that somebody will choose that. I haven't encountered many people saying that they're self-conscious about sharing early versions. I've heard more instructors say that when I discuss process tracking on social media, but I haven't heard students say that as much. A few students are sort of like, I don't love it, but I think it's necessary. And more I would say are comfortable with it, especially in an online class where it's asynchronous and they sort of feel like there's a need for it. Um, I did encounter one case where I'm pretty sure a student did use something that simulated typing into the doc, or maybe just retyped AI text, which is another way to bypass it. So I think that I have seen that happen, unfortunately. But again, it seems like that's not something at the top of every student's mind that they can do that at this point. I don't know how common it is. Um, But I do feel like, yes, it reduces misuse. It does put up another barrier. It does make it harder to do the wrong thing. Um, so right now, my approach is letting students choose from 4 options. So before we actually do the draft, I have this little assignment, 5 points, and I say, well, which of these options do you want to choose? And you can share any comments or questions with me about it. And they can choose either of those 2 apps I described, or just sharing edit access on a Google Doc. For some of them who are overwhelmed at the beginning of the semester, they say, I just want to share the edit access because that's simpler. Um, and I've had people pick all 4 of these options so far. So there's been quite a range of response. Um,
I mean,
and
yeah,
I put
there's,
a link. Yeah.
oh, sorry, go ahead. I was gonna ask, there was a few other questions.
Sure. Yeah, I could take those now.
The other one was with the detection tools, how do they handle when a student is using adaptive technologies? What are typically typically AI based? Do they unfairly mark those students with challenges and disabilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I I did ask a Grammarly representative about voice typing and whether that's recorded in the process report. Um, I don't think it is perfectly yet, and I do try to address that explicitly when I introduce the process assignment and say that if you need to use another app, um, or for some reason you think this doesn't reflect your process, just let me know, and I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt about that. Or they can choose that 4th option. So really, again, this is not, everybody has to do the same thing. I am being flexible. Um, but I share that concern for sure. And I know that maybe students are writing on their phone on some other app, or they're using another app for accessibility. The process tracking might not pick up everything they did. And so I need to be ready to essentially probably trust them if they tell me that. Um, so it's not a perfect gotcha, but it does create that other layer of like, they need to talk to me, they need to communicate with me about their process in some way. Um,
Thank you so much for that.
yeah,
There was one other general question is how do you help your students understand how to ask an AI tool for tutoring style assistance?
yeah, that's a great question. So I have an article in my textbook that talks about different forms of tutoring style assistance. And I will get to that a little bit later when I talk about feedback. So maybe I'll bracket that for later. But there are a bunch of strategies that we can encourage them and kind of scaffold for them. Um, so yeah, if you do want to see like my template assignment on the process tracking, it's up on Canvas Commons, and you're welcome to adapt it. Um, Now, this is very controversial. In the task force that I'm on, I am the one person who is using process tracking and arguing for it having a place. And we actually did a blog post where we sort of did a roundtable disagreeing with each other about whether it's surveillance, whether it's intrusive, um, and so that might be of interest. I tend to see it as a form of close observation, more akin to in-class writing in that spirit. Um, and it feels important. Um, I will say that I am concerned about the future of this. So are we going to need some in-person observation of students even for online classes going forward? I'm concerned because of AI agents, because of this sort of ChatGPT agent, and Perplexity has just come out with a browser. And essentially, this is a system that will, on its own, take actions on the web, including in a learning management system. I just tested this with Perplexity's Comet. Perplexity is an AI company. It's sort of like a Google search, but with more AI built in. And they have just made this free to students. Um, and it will do your work in the learning management system. I think Claude does have something as well. Um, so all the companies are moving in the direction of agents, and those agents currently are not blocked from completing work in a learning management system. And so you can see a video like in this one, David Wiley shows how ChatGPT agent, he tells it, check Canvas to see if I have any homework due, and if I do, complete it. And it does it. So in that scenario, the student isn't even seeing what the assignment was. They don't even know if it was motivating, right? So that's really concerning to me. And Trisha Bertram-Gallant, again, she has really expressed concern about online assessment, the integrity of that going forward, given this kind of thing, and that we might need to talk about having some kind of proctored assessments, even for online courses. So this is also an approach coming out of Australia from the University of Sydney, the idea of periodic secured assessments to validate learning, but then most of the time doing less secure formative assessments. I think we've got to be having those conversations because I think agent mode is really like it's already here, but most people haven't realized it. But we don't have a good answer to it yet. So, what we are seeing things like proctoring centers that's like the one run at UC San Diego. And this would be a huge shift, right? But it could possibly, it's not necessarily at a certain date and time. There are assessment professionals who are trained to proctor and to support learners in an assessment center. So any other pressing questions that I missed there?
There are a few really interesting questions that came in. I know I'm
Yeah,
not sure how we're doing on time, so it's up to you if you want to do
yeah.
them now or
Okay.
later.
Maybe I better say a word about the other two things
Sounds good.
and then the questions. Yeah, I want to get into them, but I don't want to end without covering the main topics. So the first thing I would say about AI detection is that we probably are trying to be detectors ourselves as we read student writing because we want to know if it's the student and if they're learning. And so we've got to ask ourselves, how well can we distinguish AI text from student writing? Sometimes that's important. We need to start that conversation because it doesn't sound like their voice. But unfortunately, studies suggest that we are not too reliable at instructors are not. So this is just a couple of studies showing that instructors often couldn't identify what was AI and what was a student writing. So that sort of might lead us to say, well, could software help us? If so, is it ethical? The idea that there is detection software might deter some misuse, right? If students think that there is this layer of accountability. But it could also reinforce an adversarial relationship. It's a sense of gotcha, cat and mouse. And you've probably heard that AI detection is not accurate. It's not fully accurate. It's not expected to become accurate. It's sort of a statistical guess as to whether the text is fitting the patterns known to be common to AI text. And sometimes it does lead to labeling of student writing as AI, wrong labeling. It might also lead to a false sense of security. Sometimes it labels AI text as human written. There's a big concern that it could be biased. One study showed that it was biased against English language learners, more likely to wrongly flag their writing. But another recent study suggested there was no bias. So that's an open question. Like process tracking, there's a way to get around it. There is free software that quote unquote humanizes AI text and runs it through detectors to try to test if it's going to pass or not. And sort of like cybersecurity, the accuracy of the detectors is constantly changing as AI and the detectors change. But it does seem like, based on some studies, that Turnitin is more accurate than many of the detectors, somewhat accurate even with paraphrased text. So the task force that I'm on has issued sort of a caution about detectors and asked teachers who use them to consider what steps they've taken to substantiate any accusation of AI use, not just trusting the score from the detector, and to engage with the student's writing in other ways, never to use detection as a sole basis for a failing grade or a consequence. So yes, AI detectors are highly problematic, and I was against them. And I have started using them again, cautiously and with a lot of disclaimers to students. In part because I had a student who was turning in what was clearly not his writing and denied it until I said, well, we'll have to go through the full academic integrity process. And I think he realized that that would mean detection software, and that would mean he would be caught. And it was at that point that he said, well, I'm not going to waste your time anymore. And I felt like he was much better served by that scenario than if I had said, well, okay, you pass. Because I had tried everything else with him, and he needed that layer of, it's really not going to work. You really can't pass. It's not your writing. And so you can look more into the debate about this. I think, even if you've heard very bad things about detection, it's worth looking at Chris Ostro's slide deck lit review of research, sort of for the complex picture of how accurate it is, whether it's biased. And you can sort of see more about my decision to use it alongside the other strategies. I'm not using it very much. I sort of say in my syllabus, I may ask you to turn work into Turnitin. I don't know if I would ask my institution to pay for Turnitin or not, but since they do, I'm like, okay, I do want to use it. But I tell the students I'm not going to trust what it tells me because I know that it sometimes wrongly labels student writing. And So I just am very upfront about how I would use it, and that I think it could be another layer of information to be used cautiously, or to initiate a conversation with them. So if you want to use that same Mentimeter and advance through, I would love to know what you think about these strategies for guardrails, and what you use and what you might consider. Um, and I know there's like very lively chat going on. So please fill out that poll. Since we are short on time, I think maybe I will just give you a taste of this last approach that I use as you're filling out the poll. Fortunately, we have to do that. I don't have to run, but I know you might have to run in 5 minutes. So another way I think of guiding students toward away from inappropriate or misuse of AI that would interfere with learning is to clarify what, an acceptable use is. So kind of a guideline about tutoring, as I mentioned. Another rule of thumb I like to say is yes to AI for input, but no for output. That might not apply in every single situation, but the idea that don't get it to produce things for you, get it to stimulate your thinking. Um, there are a lot of ethical concerns about AI that we should think about and address and acknowledge to students if we're inviting them to use it. I have a lot of resources on that here. We should certainly offer them an opt-out if we're inviting them to use it. And we can offer them some contextual education about AI, even in very short forms, and I've offered some resources for that here. But the way that I do invite my students to engage with it, that I think does support their learning, a role that I can give it in the writing process to say, okay, put it in this place and not in the other place, is for feedback. So feedback on their writing that doesn't tell them what to say or exactly what to do, but that puts something out there that they can then judge. Does that fit what I want to do in my writing? Is it aligned with my voice? And they can take that suggestion or not. I have found that feedback can be very specific, grounded in quotes from the student writing, and useful. I use it for my own writing in addition to human feedback. And there's a whole approach that I'm part of, the Peer and AI Review plus Reflection, or PAIR approach, supported by a grant from the California Learning Lab. And that invites them to reflect on AI feedback alongside peer feedback. So within a human-centered writing process. And it stimulates them to sort of evaluate that feedback critically, compare it to peer feedback, make their own decisions, kind of develop their metacognitive awareness of their writing process as they do this. And you might be familiar, we have a Google Doc packet where we just share all the materials for that approach, including the AI prompts and the reflection questions, the assignments. So that's, a way to guide them. And you can find even more prompts from Papyrus AI, which is a wonderful sister project to us, also working with feedback, but giving many more different types of prompts for different writing situations. So I hope that this has been helpful. I created a little worksheet for you if you want to kind of extend this to come up with your own multi-pronged approach and reflect on what you think of each of these. If you want to use that as part of your PD, it's just a Google Doc you can copy that lists these strategies that I've just gone over. And I would just say that it is a wicked problem, I think. I like that phrase. There's just a paper out about it from these folks, Corbin, Bood, Behrman, and Dawson from Australia, about it's not AI and assessment is something that has to be continually negotiated. there might not be correct solutions, but there might be better and worse ones. So we shouldn't blame ourselves if we don't get it perfect. But I think that um, we can explore the territory together and support each other to do so, even if we come to different conclusions. So I hope folks will share in the Mentimeter further. And I would love to know again, I don't have to run, but I know maybe others might. And I'm happy to take questions now if there's time.
Well, just start off by making a few announcements, and if anyone, of course, has to leave, we thank you for being here, but Anna is graciously going to stay on and answer a few questions. So thank you all so much for attending. Before you go, please fill out the survey. I know it's been dropped, the link a few times, and we'll drop it in one more time. And of course, if you encounter any issues or have any questions, feel free to reach out to support@cbc.edu. We also encourage you to explore other future webinars that the CBC will be offering. I'm going to go ahead and drop the link for those if you're interested in registering. And then lastly, this webinar and the associated slides will be available on the CBC website. Just please give some time for the captions to be created before they're posted. So I thought it might be a good idea to end with this positive question that Michelle Pacansky-Brock asked, which is, Anna, from your perspective of a teacher, can you share one positive outcome you have experienced as a result of AI? For example, has all of your strategizing and experimenting helped to improve your teaching or interactions with students?
I think so. I think there's something that's humbling and exciting about being in this moment with students when AI is evolving and we are trying to figure it out and trying to adapt imperfectly. And I think that by being open with students about my thinking, about my process and its imperfections, and about my curiosity about the future and about AI, there's a sense of sharing that with them and a sense of immediacy and urgency and relevancy to those discussions that does make me feel more connected in some ways with students. And also it's kind of an open pedagogy moment of, we also are learning and we can meet them in some ways as equals. And I think that feels liberating to me. We'll be shaping this AI future with students, and so we're in that boat with them, and we're just doing our best. And there's a lot to think about and a lot to be curious about. It's overwhelming, but it's also endlessly fascinating and surprising. Yeah, so that's what I would say on the positive side. Um,
Okay, there are a few other questions. I'm not sure if you wanted to go through them quickly or
yeah, detection for discussion posts. I know there's a concern with detection that it's less accurate on shorter posts. I have started doing social annotation instead of most discussion posts or video discussion posts. People use VoiceThread and PlayPosit also. Um, you could, the other thing I have done is to have people post their a Google Doc link to a discussion, and then they're commenting on each other's Google Docs, and then I can see the process history of that Google Doc. So you have that layer of process guardrail. So those are some things I've tried because I know people have felt like there's more misuse with discussions. So I think there's a question about what would have happened with the student who is facing academic review. Um, I think since the school has Turnitin, they would have run his paper through Turnitin, and I don't know if it would have been flagged or not, but I suspect maybe it would. And I also I just know that my process is not punitive with students, even if I do suspect that they've used it. I will just say, you haven't done the work yet, you haven't learned yet, but you still can. I'm not even going to grade their paper down, honestly, if they write it after they've, made a mistake and outsourced it. Um, so that's my approach. So even though I might be using detection and process tracking, it's not going to result in a fail unless they're at a point where they just can't complete the course. They're just not able to do the work. Um, and yeah, I appreciate the question about what happens to people when they offload, rely on AI too much. And I think that Leo Fong's mention of the MIT Media Lab study is just what I was going to point to. Um, And so I think we are in this paradox. And that's partly why this is so important to me. Um, because, it's that much more important to have these experiences of thinking, reading, and writing, developing your own sense of agency around those, developing a paper that you actually built, and you put those words together, and the ideas came from you in a process with various strategies in dialogue with other people, but it feels like really your paper. And that's a key experience that then shapes, maybe then later that prepares you to sometimes work in hybrid ways with AI, or to edit AI outputs, but you wouldn't even be ready to do that if you had no experience writing your own paper. Um, and that's what I want for my son, who's 14. It's like, no, I want him to have that rich experience with all its challenges and rewards. And that's why I think we do need to create some space for that, carve it out with some guardrails and some ways to discourage the offloading that's just too easy. Um,
All right, thank you so much, Anna. This has been amazing, and I could see from the comments so many people saying the same thing. We'll go ahead and respect your times and let everyone go and enjoy the rest of their afternoon.
Thank you so much to everyone. I'll be really looking forward to looking through the chat and the questions and the responses on the Mentimeter.
And we are saving the chat, and we'll try our best to upload it when we upload the webinar, because I know there was a lot of requests for that as well.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful.
Thank you all. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you.
day.
Thanks. Bye.